But this week, we're going to be talking about the divine warrior and the high priest, mostly divine warrior. I've called it that with the breath of his lips, he shall kill the wicked. And we'll get to that at the very end. But I want to learn from my mistakes and kind of lay out what I'm going to be doing first. And this, in particular, among others, this one is still definitely a work in progress. But there's, on the one hand, there's a motif that is called the divine warrior. It's an academic thing. There's like academic books, and some of that information kind of trickles down into, I don't know, popular theology or stuff that's more accessible. But there's definitely more work that needs to be done on it, and we'll see why tonight. But the divine warrior is the name that scholars give to this tradition that attributes military attire in particular, and then also military behavior and violence to God. So the divine warrior, the main elements of it are going to come from Isaiah 59:17, the book of wisdom, which is apocryphal, and we'll talk about it, and then the ones that we're most familiar with, Ephesians 6, and then also 1 Thessalonians 5:8. There's one book that's done some work on this by this Mennonite guy, and he misses some of the ones that seem to be divine warrior-esque. So if you think of like the armor of God in Ephesians 6, that is what most Christians know. Right. You know, the belt of truth, the breastplate of righteousness, those are kind of the backbone of the divine warrior motif. But there's some that don't get tagged even in the scholarly world, like in Job. There's this saying, I can't remember if it's on God's lips, but he says, I will wear righteousness as my belt and something as my belt. I can't remember. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. I have been interested in this because of course I am, and I want to think through the divine warrior motif through a more sympathetic military interpretation, I suppose. And so I'm piggybacking on last week. And it's no surprise that most Christians know that we have, quote, a great high priest, Jesus, the Son of God, in Hebrews 4:14. It gets pretty explicit. Hebrews uses Melchizedek, and which we'll talk to in a moment. But what few seem to realize is that Jesus' narrative namesakes suggest that God's salvation in Jesus is a unique combination of priestly ministry and military order. And we talked last week about Joshua, Yehoshua, son of Yehoshua ben Nun, Yehoshua ben Jehozadak, and Yehoshua ben Ben Elohim, or Yahweh. The son of Nun was an Ephraimite. The son of Jehozadak was a Levite. And then, of course, God stands alone. And Jesus, or Joshua, the Messiah, which means to smear or to anoint. I cut the anointment appointment stuff, which I mentioned, but it's really fascinating. I only touch on it very briefly later. But the anointed ones were almost all the priests were anointed. But Jesus, before I get ahead of myself, as a son of Mary, Jesus shares Levitical genetics with the son of Jehozadak. So Jesus, or Joshua, is God, grunt, and priest in one. And not just any grunt or just any priest. As God, Jesus is both the high priest and the divine warrior. And so we'll talk really quickly first about the high priest. Priests oversaw the sacrificial system, first in the tabernacle or the tent of meeting, and later in the temples, Solomon's temple and Joshua's temple, and the one that Herod likes to claim. The Hebrew word for priest was Kohen. The first is Melchizedek in Genesis 14, who is priest of the highest God. And he appears out of nowhere following Abram's military victory to give his blessing of what Christians will notice as communion elements. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the Kohen, the priest of El Elyon, the God, the greatest God. And the encounter suggests that priests were the rightful kings in the Israelite political imagination. And that kings are foreign, but if there's something like a king, it would have been the priests. It's hereditary, and what they do is actually really important. Their primary responsibility was to perform all these tabernacle and temple rites. Leviticus and Numbers describes in exacting detail the korban, or sacrificial animals, that priests slaughtered on the behalf of the people. The Leviticus 1:1, the Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when any of you brings a korban to the Lord, you shall bring your korban of livestock from the herd or from the flock." And so the korban is literally the sacrificial victim. And it draws on three root consonants, kurab, Q, R, and B, you can think of them, a verb which means to bring close. Levitical priests, therefore, are the ones tasked with bringing the people near to God through the sacrificial system. It's a hereditary responsibility, and every priest is anointed into their service when they come of age. The high priest, the Kohen Gadol, was the only one allowed to enter the Holy of Holies once a year on Yom Kippur, the most important sacrificial feast in Israel's liturgical year. And I was actually looking into this because I finally got my cincture, my monastic belt. And apparently one of the reasons that monastics wear belts is there's this tradition that suggests that the high priest would wear a belt or a robe around their feet, so that when they went into the Holy of Holies once a year, if they screwed up and they were killed, if they died, the other priests could drag them out by their feet. And that's part of the reason they have a sash, and we'll get into that. So I thought that was kind of funny that they, you never know. You might have to drag them out if you piss God off.
That's a practical use as well.
Yeah. But what's weird, though, is before the Torah tells us what priests do, it tells us what they wear. So I've brought in Exodus 28:4, and I've included some of the transliterated Hebrew words. These are the beged, the garments that they shall make. And it just lists them really quickly: breastpiece, ephod, coat, fringed tunic, turban, sash. And they shall make kodesh beged, the holy vestments, for Aaron your brother and his sons to serve me as Kohen, or Kohanim for plural. And you can see the Hebrew there. We'll get into that. But the kutenek, the tunic, is actually a generic term for any inner or undergarment. It's the same word that's used for the kutenet of skins made for Adam and Eve in Genesis 3:21, and Joseph's kutenet of many colors in Genesis 37:3. And we'll get to the Greek equivalent words in a moment. They're very important. But in the meantime, let's talk about another couple of wardrobe lists that we find in the divine warrior motif. The first of which is in Isaiah 59, verse 16 and 17. Yahweh wondered that there was no one to intercede. Then his own arm brought him yasa, salvation, and his tzedakah, righteousness, upheld him. He put on tzedakah as a breastplate, sirion, which also means armor, and a helmet of Yeshua. And there's this weird Yeshua, the noun form of yasa is yesa, but in a few, I think it's like 20 or 30 times in the whole Old Testament, it takes this weird alternative noun form, which is Yeshua. So he's literally putting on the helmet of Yeshua, the helmet of Joshua, the helmet of the anointed one on his head. He put on beged of Nacham. That happens in the holy vestments, for clothing, garments of vengeance for clothing, and wrapped himself in zeal as a me'il, which is also the coat, the outer coat that the priest wears. So let's simplify it a bit. Whereas there are 6 items that the high priest wears, the divine warrior, according to Isaiah, lists 4: a breastplate of righteousness, a helmet of salvation of Yeshua, garments of vengeance, and a mantle or a cape of fury. The Greek version combines the mantle and garments together as vengeance, saying something like, he put on a tunic of vengeance and wrapped himself in it as an outer garment as well. But in the Hebrew, it actually separates out the inner garment and the outer garment, just like it does for the holy vestments of the priest. So the next list we find is in the apocryphal Wisdom of Solomon, written in the 1st century BCE and included with the Greek Septuagint. Jesus and the apostles would have had access to this. Chapter 5, verse 17 through 20 declares, the Lord will take his zeal as his whole armor and will arm all creation to repel his enemies. He will put on righteousness as a breastplate and wear impartial justice as a helmet. He will take holiness as an invincible shield and sharpen stern wrath for a sword, and creation will join with him to fight against his frenzied foes. In the 1st century CE, just 100 years later, the apostle Saul adapts the same imagery in his letter to the Christians at Thessalonica, encouraging them to be sober and put on the breastplate of faith and love, and for a helmet, the hope of salvation. What do you guys notice between Isaiah and wisdom and the Thessalonians?
The salvation.
Salvation.
The word salvation.
I think that appears in both. Do you notice anything different?
Right. Oh, different?
Yeah.
This one. Go ahead,
sorry.
Jen.
No, I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
This one has faith and love.
Yeah. Instead of, do you remember?
Righteousness, justice.
Yeah. Righteousness.
First place, righteousness. I thought too, they're both protecting the head and heart.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
And there's less, right?
Mm-hmm.
In just 100 years, the divine warrior has gone from vengeance, fury, wrath, and zeal to faith, hope, and love. And last, but certainly not least, we get the full treatment in the epistle to the Ephesians, probably written by a person or group following in Saul's footsteps. There's so much that I got to get rid of the header and footer to make room, but this is what he writes. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God to stand firm. Stand, therefore, and fasten the belt of truth around your waist, and put on the breastplate of righteousness. As shoes for your feet, put on whatever will make you ready to proclaim the gospel of peace. With all of these, take the shield of faith, with which we will be able to quench all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. Y'all are familiar with this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also draws, we'll see in a little bit, draws into the study as a whole with the present darkness and everything else. So reading this motif closely, you might notice that there are two items that appear in each account, the breastplate and the helmet. If we look at them in Greek, using the Septuagint for Isaiah, we see a common thread with just a few outliers. The breastplate, or thorax, is mostly of righteousness, dikaiosune. And the helmet, parakephalia, is mostly of soterios, salvation. The differences help us see the unique interests of each composer. The authentic Saul of Thessalonians, for example, comes off as markedly softer in tone, departing from the breastplate of righteousness in favor of faith and love, pistis and agape. However, he uses a lighter editorial touch for the helmet, which he tempers with humility by adding the hope of salvation instead of just salvation. You know, we can only hope for salvation. It's not like we get to grab it and put it on our head and claim it as ours. Another thing to notice is wisdom's language for the helmet. Perikephalia means touching the head, and it's less militarized than korutha from chorus, which is a more direct way of naming a soldier's helmet. Crisis is also more direct, meaning judgment or damnation, than soterios, an adjective that means salvation rather than the modern idea of justice. So you see that I'll return to this. I'll try and remind myself. I forgot to add it in one of the slides. Isaiah, I've kept in green, wisdom in blue, Thessalonians in orange, and Ephesians in this purple color. But you can see side by side, it's hard to look at these and not think that they're in conversation with one another. That Saul and whoever writes for Saul in Ephesians is clearly drawing on this imagery. So by looking at these accounts side by side, we also see a distinct callback to Isaiah's earlier usage. Pseudo Saul of Ephesians seems to be correcting authentic Saul, returning to the prophetic tradition with its fire and brimstone and its sword. In Thessalonians, the divine warrior motif is qualified by a caution against wrath. In Greek, it's orge. This stands out because it seems like pseudo-Saul is reinserting an offensive weapon that wisdom called for, a sword sharpened by wrath, orge. So even more specifically, the author of Ephesians sees the author of Thessalonians as taking maybe too soft of an approach. And so where Thessalonian doesn't just take out the sword, it also adds a warning against what the sword had meant in wisdom. And Ephesians says, no, let's pull it back in, but let's qualify it. This is a sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, which is scripture. And so not only are they talking with one another, they're arguing. Wisdom, Ephesians, Thessalonians, they know what the tradition has said, and they're engaging with one another in a way, that we notice when we look at more closely. Ephesians continues its usage of wisdom by twice including the whole armor in verses 10 and 17, panoplia, albeit with subtle differences that implies pseudo-Saul is sympathetic to toning down the aggression associated with military force. Whereas wisdom attributes the panoplia to zeal, zelos, in Ephesians it belongs solely to God, panoplia theos. Not only does Ephesians bring us back to Isaiah, it also draws us back into the priestly vestments, which serve as a kind of divine armor, making the priests a kind of Israelite pseudo-soldier. So let's return to Exodus 28. There are a few details that link priests and soldiers within the Bible. Priests ministered barefoot. The laver just outside the tent in the temple was for washing both hands and feet. You can check my work in Exodus 30, verses 19 and 21. So they wash their hands and they wash their feet. That means they're not taking anything off. They're entering the courtyard barefoot. Now, this recalls God telling Moses from the burning bush, take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. The only place that happens elsewhere, and that was in Exodus 3:5, it is also anticipating Joshua doing the exact same thing, using almost the exact same phraseology at Gilgal, right before they crossed the Jordan River to battle against Jericho. Take off your shoes, you're entering holy ground. And remember, Jericho is when the priests carried the ark with an armed guard in front and behind. They never used any weapons. They circled and blew their trumpets. And then on the seventh day, they did it 7 times, let out a great shout, ruach, and then the walls came Nepal down. And so there's something linking saintliness and soldierliness that I think we need to explore much more deeply. Secondly, the outer garment, the coat or robe, depending on your translation, required special care in construction to keep it from tearing. According to Exodus 28, verses 31 and 32, they were supposed to make the me'il of all blue. It shall have an opening for the head in the middle of it, with a woven binding around the opening, like Torah, so that it may not tear. This word Torah is exquisitely unique. It only occurs in this verse and a almost verbatim repetition of it in Exodus 39:23, which is essentially a copy and paste from 28 to show how precisely that they have made the garments according to the instructions. The King James translates this word Torah as hebergion. I had to look that up. I've also seen it translated as a corselet, which you definitely do not want to look up. Apparently, the latter is some piece of lingerie. I had to look this up, and then I immediately deleted my browser history. But the former is a medieval name for a chainmail coat worn by knights in battle. In translations that provide notes, you might see an indication that another way to read Torah is like a coat of mail, so that it may not tear. The outer priestly garment was to be seamless and to remain untorn, two very unique characteristics. Now, John's writings bring us back to Jesus as high priest and divine warrior, but not just the book of Revelation. His gospel is the only one to claim that during his passion, Jesus's, quote, tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. That was from John chapter 19, verse 23. This recalls the priestly robe, which was supposed to be seamless, like a coat of chainmail, so that it may not tear. In other words, John depicts Jesus going to his death dressed for battle as the divine warrior, wearing the armor of God. Now, Exodus is careful to distinguish between the outer robe and the inner tunic, but many ancient writers do not make the same distinction. John seems to confuse the two, either by mistake or by design. But he's not the only one. For reference, here's Exodus 28, verse 4 again, in both the Masoretic Hebrew text in brown and the Greek Septuagint of the Leningrad Codex in green. The Jewish historian and military veteran Josephus sees the tunic and the robe as interchangeable, or perhaps even the same thing. In describing it to a Roman audience, he writes, "The high priest is adorned with all of these things, but over these he wears a blue chiton," which you'll notice in number 4 is the same Greek word in Septuagint for the inner tunic. Over these he wears a tunic, a chiton, reaching to his feet. In our language, it is called the me'il. And so he seems to be confusing this because that's not what Exodus says. Now, this chiton is not composed of two pieces, nor was it sewed together upon the shoulders and the sides, but it was araphos hyphantos. Essentially, it was woven as one. Exodus is careful to point out that the outer garment is to be seamless, an untorn article of clothing, and the inner one is only required to be made of fine, probably white linen. John's Gospel and Josephus's Antiquities were written around the same time, the early 90s CE, and they both seem to combine or confuse the two into one in an eerily similar way. John and Josephus each describe this tunic coat using the same Greek terms, araphos hyphantos, a seamless, single article of clothing. Josephus may only have in mind the priestly garments, but John is very likely to be describing Jesus' execution attire with a divine warrior in mind, who approaches Golgotha dressed in battle in something like a coat of chainmail to mock death and deprive it of its sting. But there's another final parallel linking Jesus' messianic military traits with the role of the high priest. Do I have any questions before I continue on and wrap up?
What you said with that word, I think it's Tara, was in what's it called?
The Hebrew?
In
Exodus.
Well, understood in the King James translation. What is it understood today in our translations?
It's one of those words where they are not exactly sure.
Oh.
The modern Hebrew language was revived. It was considered dead.
Right.
And so the Masoretic text only dates to like the 12th century. So there's not always the most certainty over what some of these words mean. So the root that we get Torah from, I may not have added it, but there's two possibilities. One seems to suggest the hole at the neck, which was unbroken, or when it says not woven down the side, it's like there's seams. There's no seams. See, It makes me think of you can't see the line, can you, Russ, from Christmas Vacation? You can't. There's no line. There's no seam. It's all one, woven as one. And so it may be this the only hole at the neck, and the other one, I can't remember how to pronounce it. can be translated as white, but like white hot. And so it can be used synonymously with anger, with armor. And so that's why, you know, in most English translations, like a garment. In most English translations, they say is like, oh, it's like a garment. I don't know what kind of garment, but it's a garment. You know, we know it's a garment. We know that much. But if you want to dig into the Hebrew, it does mean something slightly more specific. And that's why, like in the King James, they're like, well, it's like a harbor, whatever. I don't know. And that's like the medieval term for a chainmail coat. And so that's what seems important to me, is that, and somewhere in there, the word Syrian, the Hebrew word Syrian, is used in the divine warrior stuff. And I don't think it's always breastplate, but it does happen every now and then. Unfortunately, Isaiah is the only one with Hebrew. Wisdom was only composed in Greek, and then the Gospels are in Greek. So that's why I've leaned more towards Greek. But the word Torah, it only happens in those two places. And so they have to kind of like guess what the intent was behind it. And that's the safest guess is it means it's a garment. It's some kind of garment with a hole. But if you want to get technical, it's very likely it means something more like a chainmail vest that you cannot tear.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Jen, do you have any questions? You got time, so I made sure to keep this one shorter.
Yeah, no, I find it fascinating. I actually love that image of Jesus you have there on the left. To think that there was, you know, for me, I just think about the tunic. It's part of his clothes, you know, but actually has real meaning, you know, as you described it.
Yeah, and John,
like a warrior type, like what a warrior would wear.
John goes out of the way sometimes to insert meaning. So most of the Gospels, especially Luke, like Luke is more interested in like, okay, what can we really know? Like, sure, there's miracles, and we can't explain that. I'm a doctor, like whatever. But like, I want to know some of the details of what happened. I want to be able to verify it. But John has no problem like pulling stuff from all over. So one of the things, I don't know if we've gone over it here, but John, if you've heard of the Agnus Dei, the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world, that appears in John, and it appears in Revelation. I think it may actually also appear in the Johannine epistles. But if you read the Old Testament and you're careful about these nerdy things, there's no such thing. The animal that takes away the sins of the world is the scapegoat.
Scapegoat, right?
And it must be a goat. It must be a goat. There's two goats, one for the Lord, which is slaughtered, and then before, so in Yom Kippur, the goat is slaughtered where everybody can see it. And then, in the holy space. I think it's behind the curtain. Then he comes out with his bloodied hands, doesn't wash, takes his bloody hands, puts that on the hand of the goat for Azazel, which William Tyndale, the English translator, said, oh, it's like the scapegoat. And then somewhere the E got lost. But the scapegoat gets the bloody hands put on their head, and that symbolizes the sins of the people passing to the goat. And then it's let loose into the wilderness. And later tradition suggested that someone actually went after the goat and pushed it off a cliff. And I write about this in Grunt God, like that it's a goat is important for a couple of reasons. One of them is symbolic. Like there's an important difference between sheep and goats. It has to do with what they eat. Goats can eat anything. They can go wherever, they can eat anything. They don't need anybody. And they make it very clear that they don't need you if you try and like hang out with them. Sheep, however, have a symbiotic relationship with people, and they only eat weeds and grasses. They need protection from shepherds and the herd, and they need humans to shear them once a year. If they don't, they overheat and die. So sheep are docile. There's one of these lines that John uses, silent before the shearer. Like they freeze up and freak out. Goats will headbutt you if they don't like you. So when John says, behold, Jesus, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, he's confusing his metaphors. There is no baby sheep. that takes away the sins of the world. In Passover, it says you are to take it from either the sheep or the goats, whatever you can afford. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be a sheep. It doesn't have to be a goat. It can be a dove. Or you like connect with another family and eat their calf together with them. So nowhere is there a baby sheep or a sheep that takes away the sins of the world. It's a goat. And John either doesn't understand this or is consciously combining the two holidays into one, because that's what happens on the cross. It happens on Passover, where you're supposed to splatter the blood. You either have a horror show on your door or you have it in your house, right? So he is the Passover sacrifice, but as the one who takes away the sins of the world, he's a goat. He's the goat, greatest of all time. So John has much more fluidity with facts. Like it's just not true. There's no lamb that takes away the sins of the world, but he makes it work. And in the same way, John, when he depicts Jesus going to the cross, it is a scene of war. And one of those is by saying, you know what, I'm going to say he's in this priestly garment. And his priestly garment is supposed to be single, without a seam, and it's supposed to be untorn. And so after Jesus dies in 1923, he says, after that, the soldiers, the stratiotes, this rank and file grunts, they split up his clothes, but they don't tear it in order to fulfill what was written, that they divided their clothes amongst me, blah, blah, blah. And that seamless, untorn piece is John's way of saying, this is the high priest in the armor of God going to war. And it doesn't matter that like chiton is just like, it's this thing in Greek and in the Greek speaking kind of popular world, like it's your underwear. Jesus was in his underwear going up to the cross, but he adds these points to pull in the symbolism from the priestly garments, the holy vestments. Ready?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't hear you. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're fine.
Okay, so the last little piece, which I still find so fascinating. Josephus, the historian and military veteran, he calls Antonia, which is attached to the temple complex, built by Herod. It's like Herod's shopping mall complex. He's so proud of it, Mall of America. Josephus calls Antonia an acropolis or citadel for the archairos, the high priest, where the stole, the vestments for the high priest, were kept. It's not a coincidence. The priests, the Kohanim, were like Israelite service members, the highest of which was the Kohen Gadol. Jesus is both the high priest and the divine warrior. Josephus also describes the process of retrieving the stole agios. They were kept under the seal of the high priest, and the treasurers of the temple, which treasurers the day before a festival went up to the Roman captain of the temple guards, the Jerusalem cohort, and viewed their own seal and received the vestments. And again, when the festival was over, they brought it to the same place and showed the captain of the temple guards their seal, corresponding to their seal, and they deposited them there. It's like a bank vault. The Jews bring their seal, and the Romans have their seal, and they match them up to make sure that you are who you say, and then you can walk off with the holy vestments. But what's important to point out is that is literally the function of a vestry or a sacristy. Right beside the temple, where you go get your clothes and you get suited up in your fancy little costumes, is the vestry. And in the first century, when Jesus was doing his thing, Antonia Fortress was the temple sacristy. Anytime the high priest wanted to go get dressed, he had to go to the military guard, the Jerusalem cohort, and retrieve his holy vestments and then go back to the temple.
He had to go to the military to be able to do that?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. And
there's competing ideas for what it looked like. The one I have is the one in Jerusalem. They've built a model, but there's not a strong consensus as to whether or not this approximation is right, or there's another one that I don't have in here that's the Antonia is much bigger, and then the temple is like kind of like a side thing. But Josephus goes on to say He describes the fortress in greater detail, which brings me to this interesting part of Jesus's temptation before he begins his ministry in the military district of Israel up in Galilee, Hagoyim. Josephus again conflates military and ministry elements, this time in architecture rather than in fashion. He claims that the Jews called Antonia the tower, Pyrgos, even though he describes it as having 4 pyrgoi, 4 towers. The tallest tower, I don't know if this image has it or not, the tallest tower was a full 25 feet higher than the others. And that tower was the pinnacle or the citadel of the entire holy city. So reading this in light of Matthew and Luke, it sure seems like Satan has taken Jesus to Herod's Antonia fortress, the crowning achievement of Herod's new and improved temple complex. So it says in Matthew and Luke, to the Patergion of the temple, the Hieron, but no part of the temple itself was higher than Antonia. The highest point of the city, the pinnacle, the temple, the tower, the citadel, was that highest tower of Fort Antonia. So when Jesus says, or when Jesus is taken up to the pinnacle of the temple, it may be that Matthew and Luke and the first century Jews saw the whole thing as the temple complex. But really, if you're at the highest point, you're at a military base. And I double checked, it's not quite the same. At the end where Josephus says, commanding a view of the whole temple, I double checked it. It's an entirely different temptation. Satan takes him to a tall hill and you can see all the kingdoms of the world. And that, in my mind, it's not the same language, but it really evoked Josephus's words here, commanding a view of the whole temple. And so if those two are intertwined, just spitballing, when Jesus is tempted at the top, that's somehow conjoined with the worlds and the temple, that everything is getting kind of mixed up. I don't know if that's true. It just makes me think like, and Matthew and Luke have different orders for the temptations, but they both have the same ones. I can't remember which is which, but one of the temptations is the pinnacle of the temple, and the other one is a high mountaintop. And the high mountaintop is the view of all the worlds, all the kingdoms of the worlds. And it just, as soon as I read that line from Josephus, I was like, I wonder if they're borrowing again, because Josephus and John definitely seem to be talking about, there's probably some common source, and maybe it's Septuagint. There's definitely something going on back and forth between Josephus and the evangelists. So the proximity of the military with ministry, of, say, militant holiness, is right there from the very start, though. After Yahweh destroys the whole earth and spares Noah's family, God declares, I have set my keshet in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When the keshet is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. And this is known as the Noahic covenant. That thing in the sky that symbolizes the Noahic covenant, we think of as a rainbow, puppies and sunshine and Skittles and rainbows. But before, the so-called rainbow symbolized gay pride, before it was a cutesy design that parents like me painted on our kids' walls. What do you think it was? I've put my
part of the armor.
Oh, bow. Oh,
archer's
cool.
bow. And this is mentioned elsewhere in the Bible, like it doesn't say rainbow.
Yeah, it just says bow. Right.
God's promise to not destroy by flood is a paradoxical reference to a weapon of war, which God points at himself, foreshadowing God's readiness to suffer violence, even death, on a Roman cross at the demand of his own community of faith. Jesus is the ultimate high priest, but he's also the divine warrior, ready to wage battle against our own sinfulness. Saintly soldierliness is integral to the Christian faith. We passed over anointment, but it's important to point out again that every priest, high and low, was anointed when they came of age and began their Levitical service. If you want to think of or explore the anointed one, you start with a priestly class. A few kings were, but they were the exception rather than the rule.
Mhm.
Like the leather-clad shields, ancient Israelite foot soldiers anointed with oil to keep supple for
Whoa.
war. Israel's anointed ones were weapons in the war against worldly sinfulness. Belts, too, if they were to last, had to be anointed with oil. So let's keep going further back in Isaiah where the divine warrior motif truly originates. The Lord shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, which Revelation uses later, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins. Isaiah 11, verses 4 and 5. Be strong in the Lord, in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. When we put away the binary partisanship of either or, we will begin to be able to appreciate the full witness of Scripture as it concerns soldiers. We can stop cherry picking the Bible to ignore, minimize, or exclude seemingly vicious verses. We can read passages like this not with political anxiety, but with hopeful tension, anticipating and participating in God's victory over sin. Isaiah 11, verses 1 through 9. There shall come a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, like in Isaiah 61. The Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb. The leopard shall lie down with the young goat. And the calf and the lion and fattened calf together, and the little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze. Their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child put his hand on the adder's den. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea, just as God's Spirit covered the waters in Genesis. So I concluded with that because it seems to tie in a lot of these things. We have the peaceable kingdom. We have the divine warrior. We have the stump of Jesse. In those conversations, the divine warrior, verse 5, the righteousness of be the belt around his waist, faithfulness the belt. It doesn't come up, but it's there. And too often, I hear, I'll use one example, the Bible Project. Great group of people. They have these like explainer videos. They're really engaging. They came out with a new app. I'm like addicted to it. But I looked on their app for like soldiers and veterans and battle. And one of the ones where they attack it most directly, the main guy, Tim Mackey, is like, I find it so hard to talk about. I have avoided this forever. And, but it's just got to be done. So they begin talking about it's something on the divine council, which is like God's host, the host of heaven is like, there's a synonym between the stars and the soldiers, or the Elohim, the other Elohim, the spiritual beings. But I heard that at the very beginning of the podcast. I've been avoiding this for so long. And the church avoids it. Christians avoid this. Meanwhile, 90% of veterans who are taking their own lives are Christians. We can't keep avoiding this. We can't keep forcing the work onto the shoulders of untrained, hurting people.